We're already in the year 2026. Matter of fact, we're in the next month. We have started from it's like past a blinking of an eye from January to February. But as a church, we have got some things that we've initiated. I think it's very, very important as I get into the lesson today. Is it already is up here, we have picked a theme for this year of growth in knowledge and faith and obedience and service. We also, every week, we repeat the idea of a mission of equipping disciples to make new disciples. So to me today, I'm going to look at the question, well, if from the perspective of the church, we have a mission and we have a theme. But I do know in 1 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, Paul is addressing the church at Corinth that there are roles to be played of the members in the church. So as a church, we have the opportunity to be a part of each and every one of us in a role to play in coming together as one as we start this year of 2026. But a question comes, well, what is my role? What am I good at? And maybe what I'm not good at. So the question comes up, okay, Paul is addressing the church at Corinth, and from God's design it's saying there's different roles because we have different backgrounds, we got different abilities, we got different opportunities for those to serve. So roles are very important, and we all need to be thinking of a role that we want to be a part of because we've already put out an opportunity to look at the areas of service and maybe an area that you would like to be a part of. So it's something to contemplate on, but yet at the same time you're thinking, well, really and truly, what am I good at? But we do know it's a responsibility as individuals. I'm going to talk about two today that every one of us in this room and in the congregation as a whole can do. The first one is prayer. Prayer can be something that all of us can do and be a part of. It's a great blessing from God. It gives you the opportunity in two areas. As we think about it in James 5:13 and 19, it's conveying here that the power of prayer. You're praying for those who are physically sick, those who are spiritually sick, and maybe even to the point of yourself. It also brings out the example of Elijah, the great prophet who prayed and earnestly to the point that stopped rain for 3.5 years. That's how powerful prayer is. And he alludes to that in this narrative that we see in James 5:13 through 19. So if I'm considering and pondering on really what I'm good at, I know that all of us can do this, is pray. Also in Philippians 4:6 and 7, it talks about it helps us to grow closer to God. And by growing closer to God, then we can have the opportunity to actually make better decisions and ask God to help us in those decision making, especially in deciding a role. Because as Paul is indicating in that letter to Corinth, you need to be thinking about a role, your contribution toward the opportunity, toward the oneness of the church as we begin this year 2026 as a church. And the church are people. You and I are the church. So we need to be considering this idea of what our role is. The one I really want to talk about today is the word influence. Influence. All of us in this room can be involved in influence. And I want to emphasize the fact in 1 Corinthians 11 and 1, Paul is addressing the church at Corinth and saying, I want you to emulate me as I emulate Christ. And I'm thinking, wow, that's pretty awesome, isn't it, for you? I'm just thinking, me as Steve Murdock walk up to somebody and said, I want you to emulate me as I emulate Christ. And more times we don't actually say that, but that's what Paul is so convicted in toward showing how important it is for influence. He is saying to people in general, I want you to emulate my behavior, my faith, and my sacrifice. That's his influence. This is influence, is what Paul is emphasizing on. Now I want to look at Matthew, one of the great, it's actually the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is talking in Matthew 5 and it's 13 and 14. And this is how important influence it is. And these are the praying and influence all of us in this room can do. It's not a matter of what other roles you want to play. These two are extremely important. So it says, you are the salt of the earth, but the salt loses its saltness. How can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world, a town built on a hill that cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, it is put on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. It is the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. A wonderful opportunity to be the salt of the earth and to be the light to the world. And it really starts with you. It's an odd phrase, but one of the roles that people will contemplate on saying, well, I'm just not a leader. I'm just not someone that can be in charge. But I'll have to disagree. You are a leader. You are a leader and the CEO of your soul. You will make the decisions of eternity based on your judgment and your decision making. You are the leader of your soul. You are the CEO. So to some degree you are a leader. And in leading, you have to put in perspective of these two areas and others that I'll be talking about, especially influence. That it's your responsibility to make that choice. It's up to us to make those choices because we are afforded opportunity to have the truth. Truth sets us free. And of course, even today, as we're contemplating on it. I want to look at two people today dealing with the idea of influence, especially the man named Titus. Very little said about Titus. He's mentioned about 13 times in the New Testament. But Paul wrote specifically a personal letter to Timothy, and he wrote a personal letter to Titus, which by all means is honoring these two men. To some degree, you kind of think, well, why in the world would you pick these two men? They were both led to Christ in the first missionary journey that was between Paul and Barnabas. And he's writing a letter, it's around AD 63 to 64 to these two men. And 1 Timothy and Titus are correlated very closely because one in the aspect of, as we look at Paul to Timothy, is on leadership. The letter to Titus is on the organization of the church. But the one thing that's puzzling is that actually, to being crude, is Timothy is a half-breed. His daddy was Greek and his mama was Jew. And later on, Paul asked him to be circumcised to be more effective. Because what Paul is going to delegate in large instances is that Timothy is going to be working at the church at Ephesus. He also works with Paul on the second and third missionary journey. Then it's very odd that he picks a man named Titus, who is a Gentile, uncircumcised, young as Timothy is, and he's going to entrust him not only his work in Corinth, but his work in Crete, an island. So to me, to some degree, it's kind of odd, isn't it? These two are not necessarily all their background meets maybe the criteria maybe that people would think, the esteem that Paul would see would be great. But yet at the same time, if we're thinking about influence, look at Paul. He was actually at one time Saul, who killed Jews and imprisoned Jews. And yet here is a man that had a discussion with a man named Jesus that converted him, and he became, through that conversation, became a great missionary minister, as well as a profound writer, especially to the work of the influence to the Gentiles. Can you imagine? I know it took years before, because it's a number of years before he and Barnabas took a man named Titus to the city of Jerusalem to talk about the issue dealing with circumcision. Because the Jews were actually trying to compound the fact that in order to be a good Christian, you had to be circumcised. As far as we know, that Titus never was circumcised, because Titus had an influence that he will have with the Gentiles, as well as Timothy, to some degree, to the Gentiles, as well as to the Jews, because the mission of Paul, to a large extent, is this connecting between Jews and Gentiles. And it kind of fits together here. You've got a man named Titus working as a Gentile, Greek, and yet he is a part of this discussion in Jerusalem with Paul and Barnabas that leads the opportunity for Paul and Barnabas to go on the missionary journey. Isn't that amazing? And this is the influence that this man Titus had, the influence that Timothy had, the influence that Paul regarded them highly. Isn't it amazing to write a personal letter to each one of them? That's very amazing, to the point of their responsibility. And of course, as I look at that, they were, of course, and then involved in the second and third missionary journey with Paul. Paul felt very much at ease with them. Now, I want to turn my attention now to Titus. As I mentioned earlier, he was only mentioned 13 times in the Bible. I would see him as behind-the-scenes type individual, but yet he was very well recognized by Paul in, if anything, his influence. I don't know how much knowledge that Timothy had or Titus had, but it must have been a very effective influence, because he put, as I said, Timothy in charge of Ephesus and Titus involved in both Corinth and Crete. And of course involved in those many different missionaries' efforts in the second and third. Some descriptions of Titus. And this is what Paul wrote about Titus. He was acknowledged and beloved as a disciple, as we see in Titus 1 and 4. He was considered a fellow worker in the gospel in 2 Corinthians 8 and 23. Paul refers to him as my brother in 2 Corinthians 2:13. Paul refers to him as my partner in 2 Corinthians 8 and 23. And then the one that it really brings the influence of not only helping the Gentiles or the Greeks, the perspective of what Titus was the fact, Galatians 2, 1 through 10, he's in a debate on this issue about circumcision with Paul and Barnabas. And he brings Titus along. That helps convey the importance and acceptance, if you'll read that footnote, the acceptance of Paul being an apostle, and sets forth the missionary journey. And of course, the part of instrumental perspective of Paul and Barnabas and the effects it had later on in the So, my question is, okay, the influence is from that perspective. So I'm looking at myself. You think, well, my background, how can I be influential? How can I be effective to people in the world or in my home or in the church? As I'm thinking, how do I fit in the role to help substantiate our theme, to help substantiate our mission? That question is answered by being closer to God, reinitiating the opportunity that I'll do my very best. Can you imagine Paul, who is at one time Saul? He's actually has killed people. He's put them in prison, got special permission to go to Damascus to do even more. A very zealous Pharisee of Pharisees. He was a Jew of Jews, thought he was doing the right thing, and he had a conversation, as I mentioned earlier, with a man named Jesus. And he realized he was making some poor choices. And of course, he meets up with a man named Ananias. And Ananias is conversing with the mission that he was asked to do. And he said, Lord, do you know exactly who you're asking me to go see? Do you not know this is the man that kills Jews and puts them in prison? And he went. Ananias went. So you can see the influence was not the best. But then the choice was made that he realized that Jesus has picked this man to be the influence to the Gentiles, the bridge between the Jews and the Gentiles. And if you think about it, I don't know how much knowledge Titus had and Timothy, but they sure did have a whole lot of influence. And I want to go over some characteristics that I see that may help you and me in this man named Titus. In 2 Corinthians, Titus, and of course, and in Titus, Titus was Paul's true son in our common faith. Titus was Paul's genuine brother. As I mentioned earlier, Titus was Paul's partner and fellow worker. In 2 Corinthians 8, Titus was Paul's companion in spiritual walk. And Titus was Paul's comrade in conduct and behavior in 2 Corinthians 12:18. Thus, Titus was an example to other Christians, including us. He did not allow the fact of limited being not a Jew. He did not limit the fact that he was not circumcised to keep him from doing what the Lord had asked him to do through the efforts with Paul. So as looking at maybe some things that were demonstrated by Titus that you and I can do to help in influence. Number one, there are 4 factors as I close out the lesson. Number 1 is reliable and dependable. Is one way of showing influence. The proven worker. Titus was a Gentile and trusted companion of Paul who accomplished him in the pivotal Jerusalem conference that I mentioned to you in Galatians, the 2nd chapter. He was trusted with difficult tasks. Paul relied on Titus to handle challenging situations such as correcting the rebellious church at Corinth and setting up in order the churches in Crete. We'll see that in Titus 1 and 5. He had financial integrity. He was trusted with the collection of the saints in Jerusalem, demonstrating his integrity in managing resources in 2 Corinthians 8 and 6. I think it's very important and not to take away from following God's will because, the scriptures are laid out from Genesis to Revelation on 3 things. It's God, God's will, and the relationship with man. And man has that choice of obeying or not obeying, or being faithful or unfaithful. And yet here is a man that's showing this. You're showing it by actions. I think we have to have somebody in our lives, physical in lives, that can help us along in being and having a good opportunity of influence. We have to not take away from God, God's will, and our relationship with Him. But physically, there's somebody you have to gravitate to help you along the way. I think that's very, very important. And that's why we have the church. That's why we come together to be able to do that. The second thing is a firm and decisive leader that this man, Titus, was. He set in order, and Titus was tasked with organizing and stabilizing immature churches in a hostile, immoral environment in Crete by appointing qualified elders, as we see in Titus 1 and 5. Confronting error, he was expected to silence false teachers and correctly unruly individuals with authority, ensuring sound doctrine prevailed, as we see in Titus 1:10 and 11. He was the warrior of grace. He was strong, principled leader who could handle difficult situations with people without losing his focus on the gospel. Number 3, a model of personal godliness, a pattern of good works. Paul commanded Titus to be an example to the church, as we see in Titus 2 and 7. He demonstrated integrity, dignity, and sincerity of his actions. Spiritually mature, he was described as the true son, as we see in Titus 1 and 4, and suggesting a deep, mature faith and close spiritual bond with a man named Paul. And he was courageous despite his challenges of working in Crete, a place known for dishonesty. Titus held firm to the conviction and didn't succumb to surrounding pressures. And then finally, he was a peacemaker. He was a diplomat, calmed the Corinthians, thus successfully navigated the strained relationship between Paul and the Corinthian church, as we see in 2 Corinthians 7, 6 and 7. Caring concern, Paul highlights that God put earnest care in the heart of Titus for the believers, as we see in 2 Corinthians 8:16. So as we're looking and thinking, not only the fact of influence is something we can grasp within our hands and that we can pray, these are some things that we can gravitate to, that we can learn from a man named Titus, how he influenced the responsibility he had in 2 areas, and that's the church at Corinth and the church at Crete. And it's amazing that he's a Gentile. Well, guess what most of these people were? They were Gentiles. He could relate to them. And he was so, I guess, convicted, being dedicated to God and to Christ and his relationship with Paul, that he was willing to even go to the church at Corinth and be very much involved there. And so as we're looking at influence, as you're looking maybe at the roles that you can play here, and we afforded everyone the opportunity it would like to be in part of any role here. Those 2 you can do. And apparently the idea of influence is really what's helped Titus be who he was. I think in 2 Timothy, I'm thinking around the 2nd chapter, the last time that Titus is ever mentioned. But he played a big role. He did his part. He was very faithful. And he didn't let anything inhibit him from being in his role in the church. So as we're thinking about you picking the roles that maybe you want to be in or have been or continue to be in, nothing is insignificant. But I do know in closing these two things you can do and I can do. And that is pray and be a good influence. So I hope we can use this as we're getting started in this new year, as we're getting involved in the theme and involved in our mission statement, and that all of us need to be a part of that role of the church as one here at Oak Hill. Thank you.